morning. Please be seated. First of all, great job to the teams yesterday for all your efforts, whether you won or lost. We were grateful for your participation and your good spirits. Hearing from our Jarvis lecturer, Dave Diaz, on Tuesday about his work in federal government and public service, about the critical importance of teamwork and humility, and about the security of our nation today and over time has, I think, set up nicely for this morning's speaker and the ensuing conversation focused on federal law enforcement and the war in Ukraine. Matt Axelrod, RL class of 1988, was one of the top scholars and most versatile members of his graduating class. An excellent student across all disciplines, Matt was a National Merit Finalist, winner of the Dartmouth Book Award, the Latin Prize, and the English Prize. He was associate editor of the yearbook, an actor in several dramatic productions, a player on both the varsity basketball and lacrosse teams, and a member of both Debate and Model UN in increasingly prominent roles over the course of his RL tenure. He was also a proud and energetic camper at Camp Beckett, and I know there are some fellow Beckett campers in the house today, for over 5 years. In Matt's Class 1 essay, he wrote the following, quote, "A special item of significance hanging in my bedroom is my framed poster of John F. Kennedy. Written across the top are the words, 'Every man can make a difference, and every man should try.' My goal in life is to somehow make a difference. As Mr. Jarvis often says, from those to whom much has been given, much will be expected. I know that I have been given so much, and I just hope that I will be able to live up to the expectations that others have for me and that I have for myself. However cliche and naive it may sound, I really do want to change the world," end quote. I believe that in the years since he wrote that essay, Mr. Axelrod has made good on the goals of his senior year self. Last winter, he was confirmed by the Senate to serve as Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement at the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security. In this role, Matt leads an elite group of special agents and analysts dedicated to the enforcement of the country's export control laws. They work to protect and promote U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives by stopping the export of sensitive goods and technologies that can be put to malign use, like weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, terrorism, and human rights abuses. A longtime public servant with both criminal and national security experience, Matt spent more than 13 years at the Department of Justice. As an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of Florida, he prosecuted a number of high-profile cases, including those involving drug cartels, corrupt public officials, and Cuban spies. After 6 years in Miami, Matt was assigned to Department of Justice headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he served in several capacities, including as the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General, one of the department's highest-ranking officials, in which he advised the Attorney General on the department's most consequential criminal and national security enforcement matters. Matt also previously served as special counsel in the Office of the White House Counsel, where he worked on both domestic and national security matters, and as a partner in an international law firm, where he conducted internal investigations in white-collar defense work. Matt graduated from Amherst College with a degree in English, and he earned his law degree from Yale. In the 2 years between college and law school, Matt was involved with City Year, a forerunner and inspiration for the AmeriCorps service program, and with the Anti-Defamation League. In short, Matt has enlisted his ability to do great work in order to do good work as well. Please help me welcome back to Roxbury Latin, along with several of his classmates in the gallery, Matt Axelrod.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan, for that kind and generous introduction, but with your indulgence, I'd like to offer an alternate one. Our speaker today endured a mix of success and failure while a student here as a member of the class of 1988. He tried out with me for the Glee Club, but I politely informed him that maybe his talents lay elsewhere because they sure did not include an ability to carry a tune. His academic career included a C+ on his Western Civ project, a plaster and clay model of Masada that a classmate later launched out of the third-floor reading room window. Cut from the 6E and then the 5E basketball teams, he eventually played JV for 2 years, riding the bench the majority of the time. In his professional life, Matt began his legal career at Hill & Barlow, a law firm in Boston that no longer exists. 2 years in, he gave notice that he was leaving the firm for a job at the community service organization City Year, 1 week after giving that notice, he returned to the firm's managing partner and embarrassingly explained that he had changed his mind, had unaccepted the city year job, and would like his job at the law firm back. A little while later, when the firm came upon difficult financial times, Matt was unsurprisingly laid off with a group of other associates. Matt was eventually hired as a federal prosecutor in Miami, but only after years of unsuccessfully trying to get hired in the Boston office. He lost his final trial in Miami, a high-profile tax evasion case against a celebrity race car driver. 3 weeks after the not guilty verdict, the now free defendant raced in the Indy 500 and won. So I'll stop there, both for the sake of your time and my pride. But I offer that alternate introduction for a reason. I want you all to know that the people who speak from this podium, whether it's Mr. Brennan or me or some visiting luminary, none of us had a straight line path of unalloyed success, with accomplishment after accomplishment, good thing after good thing. That's a myth, just like the lives you see on other kids' seemingly perfect Instagram feeds. All of us, kids and adults, are a mix of success and failure, of good luck and bad, of advances and setbacks. What's important is that over time you continue to have faith in yourself, persist in your efforts, and hopefully keep your overall trajectory moving in the right direction. But Mr. Brennan didn't invite me here today to relive my days sitting where you were. He invited me to talk about my current role as the Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and specifically what we're doing to help degrade Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine. So in my current job, I supervise a federal law enforcement organization, which is comprised of special agents with guns and badges who police our country's export laws. In other words, they do the criminal investigations of people and companies that send U.S. goods and technologies abroad for purposes contrary to our national security. Simply put, they work to keep the country's most sensitive items out of the world's most dangerous hands. Specifically, we at the Commerce Department oversee technologies or goods that are called dual use. That is, they're capable of military use, but they're also capable of non-military, regular civilian use. Many of these technologies may seem harmless, like the graphics processing unit, or GPU, that provide amazing graphics inside your Xbox or your PlayStation. But those same GPUs, because they accelerate the creation and then the review of images by processing many items of data simultaneously, they're also being used by the Russian government to silence dissent by monitoring, identifying, and arresting protesters. And they're being used by the Chinese government to track and confine their minority Uyghur Muslim population. So our job in my part of the Commerce Department is to make sure that U.S. companies can sell the technology being used for gaming consoles, but not the technology that helps the Russian or Chinese governments repress their populations. But it's tricky because it's the same technology. And we tackle the problem a few different ways. To determine whether you're allowed to export a sensitive item like this to a certain place, we look at a bunch of things. First, where you're sending something to. Different rules are in place if you want to send something to North Korea, where there's a total embargo, it means you can't send it at all, as opposed to, say, Australia, which is a close ally of the United States. Second, we look at what you're sending. What's the technical capability of the item? How dangerous is it? Third, we evaluate the end user and the end use. In other words, who's going to use the item and for what purpose? And then fourth, we check to see whether there are any anomalies or red flags with the transaction. And I'll give you an example of a red flag. So we had one instance a few years ago where a U.S. company wanted to ship electronics through Canada and supposedly on to the European Union. The paperwork that they filed included a phone number that was said to belong to the Canadian company. And we checked the phone number to verify whether the transaction was legit. Turns out the number did not belong to the Canadian company, which made us suspicious. What made us even more suspicious was that the phone number was actually the number for a convent of nuns in Houston. And no, Sister Mary Alice was not spending her days sending electronics to the European Union. or more likely given the phony number, to Moscow. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine and the role that we're playing to help the Ukrainian people. As you've all seen play out on your televisions and your phones, Vladimir Putin launched a brutal and unjustified war against Russia's neighbor, Ukraine. Russian troops have consistently attacked civilian targets, including as recently as this week, in addition to military ones. And they've committed war crimes against the Ukrainian people in cities like Bucha and Mariupol. I imagine that the war can feel far away to you. I'd venture to say that unless you've done a lot of Model UN, you probably had never heard the names Bucha and Mariupol until this year. But what's happening now isn't something you just read about in history class. It's real life for kids just like you. Kids who are just going to school, living their lives, making TikTok videos and playing soccer. Now they have to flee their war-torn country because of Russian tanks and missiles. Our export controls have been a powerful tool in the United States' response to this horrific war of choice. The Commerce Department has worked in close coordination with an unprecedented coalition of U.S. allies and partners to restrict certain goods from going to Russia. The resulting sweeping export controls are designed to cut off Russia's access to the tools of war, and they're working. Since the first controls went into effect in February, total U.S. exports to Russia have dropped almost 86% by value. We've seen public reporting of Russian defense industries, including tank, space, and drone companies, being unable to obtain the spare parts they need to support their war efforts in Ukraine. According to a study by the Yale School of Management, over 1,000 U.S. companies have suspended or scaled back operations in Russia, and another 300 plus have stopped doing business there altogether. And none other than Vladimir Putin himself assessed in mid-July that, quote, the almost complete closure of access to foreign high-tech products is a huge challenge for our country, end quote, and that had put Russia in a, quote-unquote, state of disarray. While it's good news that most companies have complied with our new controls, we're taking action against those that don't. Let me highlight just some of what we've been doing. We've put in screening mechanisms to identify all relevant exports to Russia. When someone files paperwork saying they're shipping something that's potentially covered by the new restrictions, we'll see it in our system, and then we can stop it. So far, since the first new Russia export controls went into effect in February, we prevented 250 shipments worth $93 million from going to Russia. We've issued temporary denial orders against 10 of Russia and Belarus's airlines, including Russia's flag carrier, Aeroflot. The orders mean that those airlines can no longer receive U.S. parts for their airplanes. Over time, they'll be unable to continue flying, either internationally or domestically, as they are now cut off from the international support and the U.S. parts and related services they need to maintain and support their fleets. We also know which U.S. companies had been exporting items to Russia prior to the imposition of the new controls, in other words, items that are now restricted. And we've been reaching out to these companies both to educate them on the new rules and to make sure they're in compliance with them. And we've also opened a number of criminal investigations. While our investigations take time to turn into public criminal prosecutions, as we gather necessary facts and evidence, my prediction is that down the line you'll see some of those too. Criminal charges against companies that continue to put profits ahead of the welfare of the Ukrainian people. When we bring criminal charges, we do so with prosecutors from the U.S. Department of Justice, which, as you heard Mr. Brennan say in the real introduction, it's where I worked for 13 years before joining the Commerce Department in January. I loved my time at the Department of Justice, where lawyers have the type of job that many aspiring law students think all lawyer jobs are like, but few actually are. Your job as a Department of Justice lawyer is not to win your case at all costs, but to advocate for the right result, to fight for fairness, and no surprise, justice. Those fundamental values are shared not just by the men and women of DOJ, but by all of federal law enforcement, including my team of agents and analysts at the Department of Commerce. I know it may be a little early in your lives for career advice. You're rightly focused on today's math quiz or cross-country practice or how you'll spend this homecoming weekend. But when you do eventually focus on the long term, I'm going to put in a plug for a career in government service, and particularly for one in federal law enforcement. You all know that this school was founded to fit students for service to church and commonwealth. That's literally what government service is. It's service to commonwealth. I imagine many of you have heard the phrase, good enough for government work. It's often used as a put-down, a way of saying that those of us who work for the government don't hold ourselves to the high standards of the private sector, that we're content with sloppy work product or doing a job halfway or not nailing the small details. But what you may not know is that this phrase, good enough for government work, originally had the opposite meaning. I didn't know this till I heard the story at a DOJ award ceremony a few years back, but the expression comes from World War II. During the war, it was used to describe the extra degree of quality and workmanship that was necessary for U.S. equipment that was going to our soldiers at the front, soldiers that were fighting Hitler and the Nazis. It meant work of the absolute highest quality. That's the type of work product I've seen firsthand during my career in government service. Work done with care, with integrity, and with the welfare of the American people front and center. There's even a Latin inscription in the interior central courtyard at DOJ headquarters in Washington. It says, privilegium obligatio. Now, Mr. Randall, who is not only my advisor and English teacher, but also my Latin teacher, may correct me, both on the pronunciation and the translation, but I believe it translates roughly as where there is a privilege, there is an obligation. Or to put it in a more familiar way, from those to whom much has been given, much will be expected. You've all been given the incredible privilege of attending RL. As I'm sure you know by now, that privilege means you have an obligation to do some good in the world. So once you're done with your math quizzes and your cross-country practices and homecomings, and you're eventually thinking about how you want to spend your professional life, I'd encourage you to consider government service. Put your talents to use by making sure that good enough for government work adheres to its original World War II meaning. Offer yourself in service to the people of your town, your state, your country. That way, even after you physically leave this little nursery, you can continue to live its teachings and its values. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. All right, any questions? Hopefully not from the class of 1988. Yes?
Yes, we might try to pass this CHIPS bill to regulate the import of chips from other countries for security interests, and it faced a lot of pushback. Why do you think something with interest, like bipartisan interest, has so much trouble passing through?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think the question is that there has been an effort in D.C. to try to regulate technology and chips coming into the United States, and why has that had trouble passing? Yeah, so there have been a bunch of things that have been going on in D.C. recently related to chips and semiconductors. As you all may know, may not know, like computer chips are in everything these days, not just your phones and your computers, but like in cars and in your televisions, like everywhere. And so they're really, really important. And there is growing bipartisan consensus in Washington that chips are a real issue, but getting legislation passed in DC these days is unfortunately really, really hard. Sometimes even if something sort of makes sense on policy grounds, there are political reasons for why it won't get passed. I think for the specific issue of technology coming into the country, it doesn't have to be legislation. In other words, there are things that the U.S. government is doing, in fact, that the U.S. Commerce Department is doing to evaluate whether certain technologies from foreign companies coming into the U.S., particularly when it comes to telecommunications, are safe for our national security. And we have the authority now, I think it's under an executive order that the president issued, to make those evaluations and make determinations. It's not what my specific group in Commerce does, but it's what other people in the Commerce Department are hard at work at. So thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
What steps is Russia taking to try and get
Yeah, great question. So the question was, we've put all these restrictions in place. What's Russia trying to do to get around them? And what is the U.S. doing to make sure that they're not able to get around them? So that is something I spend every day thinking about. Yeah, we've really clamped down on Russia's ability to get these things directly from the U.S., but they need the items, and so I think they're working hard to figure out any way to get them, even if they can't get the cutting edge products they need. They'll take older ones, and there have been, for example, there have been reports of computer chips from washing machines being found inside missiles on the battlefield in Ukraine, because if they can't get the chips they need, they'll use older ones, and even though it won't work as well. So I think that they're going to places where it's not direct from the U.S. anymore, right? They'll go to places in China or in other countries, Iran, right? There have been reports recently of a lot of Iranian drones ending up in Russia and being used to attack in Ukraine. So countries that aren't part of the international coalition that I mentioned, so there are currently 38 countries that have come together that have put in complementary controls. They're going to countries that aren't sort of part of that, that are where players in those countries are still willing to provide. And our job on the enforcement side is to try to ferret that out. We do that a couple of different ways. We do it through classified intelligence, and we can use that sometimes. Sometimes it's hard because it's classified information, but we can use that to if we find out that a foreign company has been supplying Russia in violation of the controls, we put them on what's called our entity list. It's like a blacklist, which means they can't get U.S. exports anymore. And sometimes we can bring criminal charges as well. In fact, you may have seen in today's paper, if anyone reads the paper on your phone today, the Department of Justice yesterday brought 2 criminal cases against people who had been sending items to Russia. The charges were mostly for the time before the war started, but some of the items were ending up on the battlefield. So if you check today, you'll see that I think the Attorney General has a quote talking about it. But great question. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back. I'm sorry, the last part of the question was?
How do you balance this sovereignty of international countries and incorporate private corporations?
Yeah. So the question was, how do we see how do I see the U.S. role in international affairs, and how do we balance it with the sovereignty not of just other countries but also of companies in the U.S. So I work at the Department. It's a great question. I work at the Department of Commerce, and it's funny because most of the Department of Commerce is really about, supporting American business. There's a whole big part of the Commerce Department that does promotion of trade, helping U.S. companies sell into foreign markets. My part of the Commerce Department is sort of the opposite. We're the ones trying to protect U.S. technology and goods, the most sensitive ones, from going to places they can't. And there is a tension, as your question acknowledged, between the desire of U.S. business to sell their products where they want to sell them. And we're supportive of that for the most part. But there's a certain slice of technology, a certain slice of items that if it falls into the wrong hands, it's really bad long-term for the U.S.'s national security interests. And that's not good for any of you, not good for the country. It's also not good for the companies long-term if, long-term, because our technology has been taken by the Russian and Chinese governments, if they're able to eventually develop their military to such a capacity that it is technologically superior to ours, that's bad for everyone. And so that's what we're trying to prevent from happening. Yeah.
I'm interested in an average day for you.
Yeah. And what does an average day for me look like? It's a lot of meetings. I like to say I used to go to court, now I go to meetings. But it's a variety of things. So it may be that I'm doing a speech or talking with a business industry group to try to educate them about what we do and why it's important for them to comply with the rules. So that's sort of usually, not every day, but a lot of days I'll have an external event, and then it's a lot of internal things. So it's meeting with my team to figure out, okay, what's going on the latest cases, what are are our policies working, or do we need to make changes to them? It's talking to partners in other federal law enforcement agencies. Like on the ride over, I had a call with counterpart at the FBI to make sure that we were partnered up on a particular problem together. We work closely with people from the Treasury Department. Sometimes it's talking to folks at the White House, or it's other people within the Commerce Department. So yeah, sorry, it's hard to describe a typical day, but usually it's a variety of sort of external facing events, sort of internal management, and then hopefully, if I'm lucky, a little bit of time to think about like what do we want to accomplish down the road and do a little bit of forward planning. Any other questions? All right.
Despite your somewhat apocryphal story about the fact that you did not make Glee Club, Matt, when you were here, you know that I always admired you as a boy, and I admire you even more as a man. Thanks for the example of your life's work and what you've had to say about world affairs. I'm also delighted to welcome back to Rumanier his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Axelrod. We're really glad to have you here today. Welcome. Mr. Axelrod will be available in European history classes today, those two sections, and he's also available at the end of this hall if anybody wants to come up and say hello or ask a subsequent question. We're really glad that he's here. And I would say before even that I ask Class 1 to leave today, if the members of the Class of '88 could come down, because we're going to have a great picture on the stage here, that'd be terrific. If you can move down, we'd be delighted if you could do that. So come on down, gentlemen. Class 1, thanks. Have a good day.